The gun went off before Megan could reach the stairwell door. She felt the first bullet before she heard it, a punch of heat that knocked her sideways into the wall, her shoulder smearing a dark streak across the paint as she slid down. Victor Hale stood 12 feet away, hand still raised, face completely calm. Not panicked, not regretful. Calm. The way a man is calm when he's done this kind of calculation before and already decided the answer. She pressed her hand against her side. Warm, too warm. "You should have walked away," Victor said, and fired again. "Before we go any further, if you're watching this, drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Like it, follow along, because what happens next is something I still can't believe. Stay with me until the end." The morning it all started, Megan Hart was 40 minutes into a 12-hour shift and already behind. She moved through the corridor on Rivergate Medical Center's 3rd floor the way she always moved, fast, head down, aware of everything around her without looking like she was. It was a habit she'd picked up somewhere she didn't talk about, and by now it had settled into her body so deep she didn't notice she did it anymore. She noticed the orderly pushing the linen cart too close to the wall. She noticed the IV alarm 3 rooms down that nobody had silenced yet. She noticed the new security camera mounted above the nurse's station that hadn't been there last week. "Hart!" Charge nurse Debbie Paulson flagged her down without looking up from the desk. Debbie was 53, had worked trauma for 20 years, and expressed most of her emotions through the sharpness of a single syllable. Right now, that syllable carried mild irritation. Room 318 pulled his central line again. "I'll handle it." "You say that every time." "And every time I handle it." Debbie made a sound that was not quite agreement. Megan was already moving. Room 318 held a 61-year-old man named Gerald Pitts, who had been admitted 4 days ago with a perforated bowel and a personality that made the perforated bowel seem like the minor problem. He had pulled his central line twice, disconnected his telemetry leads once, and attempted to negotiate with a hospitalist about leaving AMA, using what he described as reasonable man logic, and what the hospitalist had described in the incident report as a sustained verbal assault. Megan liked him fine. "You did it again," she said, coming through the door. Gerald looked at the dangling line with the expression of a man who'd been caught but wasn't sorry. It was uncomfortable. It's supposed to keep you alive, not be comfortable. Those two things shouldn't be mutually exclusive. She worked quickly, gloving up, checking the site, assessing the damage. Not as bad as it could have been. He'd caught it early enough. She laid out what she needed on the tray and started the process of resecuring without making it a bigger deal than it was. Gerald watched her hands. "You're fast," he said. "You're not the first person to pull a central line. I mean really fast, like you've done it under pressure." She didn't answer that. She smoothed the dressing, checked the line, noted the time in her head for the chart. "My son's in the Army," Gerald said. "3rd deployment. I recognize something in people sometimes, the way they move." Megan stripped her gloves. "I need you to leave that line alone." "Were you—" "Mr. Pitts." She said it gently but clearly. "Leave the line alone." She was back in the hallway inside 4 minutes. The IV alarm was still going. She silenced it on the way past. That was Megan Hart's life at Rivergate Medical Center. Contained, purposeful, largely invisible. She was 31 years old. She'd been at Rivergate for 2 years, following a year of quiet readjustment that she didn't describe to colleagues and that showed up on her employment history only as a gap. Before the gap, there had been 6 years she also didn't describe, though some of it was classified and the rest of it she'd chosen not to carry into this version of her life. She rented a small apartment 12 minutes from the hospital. She ran in the mornings before the shift because her body needed it the way some people needed coffee. She had one close friend, a night shift respiratory therapist named Priya, who also didn't ask too many questions, and several acquaintances who knew her as reliable, professional, and difficult to read. At Rivergate, she was known as one of the better trauma nurses on the floor. Not the most popular, not someone who lingered in the break room or participated in the hospital's monthly wellness initiatives. She showed up, she did the work, she left. The attending physicians liked having her in trauma bays because she moved efficiently and didn't need much direction. The newer nurses sometimes watched her and tried to figure out where she'd trained. Nobody asked. She didn't volunteer it. The morning of the 14th, a Tuesday in late March, overcast, the kind of cold that had given up being sharp and just settled into everything, she had a full patient load and a trauma admission incoming from a highway rollover 40 minutes outside Ashford. She was reviewing the incoming report at the nurses' station when she heard Victor Hale's voice coming from the administrative corridor that ran behind the elevator bank. She wasn't supposed to be near that corridor. Her route to the supply room took her down the main hall. But the main hall was backed up with a bed move in progress, and she'd cut through the shorter way, the one past the auxiliary conference room, the one she'd used maybe 6 times in 2 years. Victor Hale was Rivergate Medical Center's chief executive officer. He had been in the role for 4 years, and in that time he'd presided over a facility expansion, a public relations campaign centered on patient outcomes, and, according to the framed profiles in the lobby, a dramatic increase in community health investments. He was 54, silver-haired, the kind of man who filled a room not through loudness, but through the certainty of his own presence. Megan had been in the same room as him twice, once at a mandatory all-staff meeting, once when he toured the trauma unit with a group of hospital board members. Both times she'd found him unremarkable in the way that very practiced people could be unremarkable. She heard his voice before she saw him. Ian, the third quarter adjustment is already in the foundation accounts. Salter confirmed it this morning. A second voice, lower, that she didn't recognize. The auditors have access to the foundation ledger. Not the one that matters. A pause. Something rustled. Paper, maybe. The disbursement shows as a community benefit allocation. It's clean. And the patient fund? Restructured. It's not patient funds anymore. It's... Victor's voice dropped, and she caught only part of it. Something about reclassification. Something about the federal reporting threshold. Megan had slowed without deciding to. She was just inside the junction where the auxiliary corridor met the main hall, and the door to the conference room was open about 8 inches, and Victor Hale and a man in a gray suit were standing at the far end of it with papers spread across the table between them. She should have kept walking. That was the correct decision, and she knew it in the moment, and she almost made it. But she heard the number. 11 million, Victor said, and the certainty in his voice was the same certainty as always, was assured, unhurried, the voice of someone who did not expect to be questioned. Over 31 months, the foundation absorbed it without a ripple. The man in the gray suit said something she didn't hear. Victor responded, "The patients won't know because the care didn't visibly degrade. We managed the metrics. That's the whole point." She was standing completely still. She realized this and made herself move. 1 step, 2 steps. But her heel caught the edge of a floor threshold. A small sound, not loud, nothing dramatic. Victor Hale looked up. Their eyes met through the 8-inch gap. She kept walking. Smooth, normal pace, not fast. She turned the corner and continued toward the supply room, and her hands were completely steady because she had trained them to be steady under circumstances considerably more alarming than this. And she was almost to the supply room door when she heard footsteps behind her. She didn't turn around. "Excuse me." She turned around. Victor Hale was alone. He'd closed the conference room door behind him. He stood in the corridor with his hands loose at his sides, and a pleasant, neutral expression that Megan recognized as the kind of expression that was doing a lot of work. "I don't think we've met," he said. "Officially." "Megan Hart. Trauma? 3rd floor?" "Right." He tilted his head slightly. "How long have you been in that hallway?" "I cut through to the supply room. The main hall was backed up." "Of course." He smiled. Brief, practiced. "Long day?" "Trauma admission incoming. I need to get back." She held his gaze because looking away was the wrong choice, and she knew it. He studied her for a moment with that same pleasant expression, and she could see him calculating, could see the machinery of it, almost. And she thought with the precise clarity that certain kinds of training produce. He's deciding something. "Get some rest when you can," he said. She went to the supply room. She gathered what she needed. She went back to her floor. For the next 3 hours, she worked the trauma admission. A 44-year-old woman from the rollover with a splenic lac and 2 fractured ribs. and she was entirely focused, and she did not make a single error, and she did not think about the corridor. Thinking about the corridor was not something she could afford to do while her hands were needed elsewhere. It was during the handoff to the surgical team that she noticed the hospital's head of security, a man named Dale Pruitt, standing outside the trauma bay watching her. Not watching the activity, watching her. She noted it. She said nothing. She completed the handoff. The rest of her shift unfolded normally. Routine charting, a medication reconciliation question, a family consultation that ran 40 minutes over because the family had not been told the actual severity of the diagnosis and weren't handling the information well. Megan sat with them and answered questions and did not rush them and thought, in the back of her mind, about $11 million and the phrase, "the care didn't visibly degrade." At 6:40 p.m., she clocked out, changed, and walked to her car. Dale Pruitt was in the parking structure. He was standing near the stairwell, hands in his jacket pockets. And when he saw her, he didn't move. He just watched her cross the structure toward her car. She drove home. She didn't speed. In her apartment, she sat at her kitchen table for a long time without turning on a light. She thought about what she'd heard and what it meant. She thought about Victor Hale's face when he'd looked up. She thought about the man in the gray suit and the phrase federal reporting threshold, which she knew enough about, from 6 years of work in institutional settings, from the procurement irregularities she'd helped document once in a context she couldn't discuss, to understand that it meant they were deliberately staying below the level that triggered mandatory federal audit. $11 million from patient funds. She made herself eat something. She went to bed at 10. At 2:17 a.m., her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She let it go to voicemail. In the morning, there was no message. She arrived at Rivergate the next day at 6:45 for a 7 o'clock shift. She was in the locker room when her charge nurse, Debbie, appeared in the doorway, and the look on Debbie's face was one Megan hadn't seen before, careful, uncomfortable, performing neutrality with visible effort. HR wants to see you before you start. What for? I don't know. Debbie's voice said she did know, or at least suspected. Probably administrative. The HR director was a woman named Sandra Key, mid-40s, whose office always smelled like eucalyptus spray, and whose professional manner normally conveyed the practiced warmth of someone whose job required them to soften bad news without appearing to deliver it. This morning she was not performing warmth. She was performing neutrality, which was worse. "We've received a report," Sandra said after Megan had sat down. "About what?" "A documentation irregularity on one of your recent charts." Megan didn't respond. She waited. "Specifically, the Pitts admission. There's a notation discrepancy in the central line resecurement entry." Megan knew her charting on Gerald Pitts's central line. She knew it the way she knew all her charting, precisely, because imprecision in documentation had consequences she'd been taught to take seriously long before she'd worked at Rivergate. "What discrepancy?" "The timestamp." Sandra slid a printed sheet across the desk. Megan looked at it. The timestamp was wrong, off by 19 minutes, putting the procedure at a time when, according to the entry itself, she'd been in the trauma bay on a different patient. These types of inconsistencies raise questions about documentation integrity. "I didn't enter that timestamp." "The entry is under your login credentials." Someone altered it. Sandra's expression didn't change, which told Megan more than if it had. "We're required to place you on administrative leave during the review process," Sandra said. "Full pay, pending investigation. It shouldn't take long." Megan looked at the printed sheet. She looked at Sandra Key. She thought about Victor Hale and the 8-inch gap in the conference room door and the calculation she'd seen him making in the corridor. "How long has this investigation been open?" Megan asked. Sandra paused. "We initiated the review this morning." This morning. Less than 24 hours after Victor had seen her face. "I'd like to speak with the CNO, Megan said, "before I sign anything." "Of course, we can, today." "I don't know if Dr. Calloway is today, Sandra." The meeting with CNO, Dr. Patricia Calloway, happened 3 hours later, and it lasted 11 minutes. And at the end of it, Megan understood that whatever had been put into motion was not going to be stopped by a conversation. Calloway was apologetic in the specific way that administrators were apologetic when they had been instructed to be apologetic but could not change the outcome. Hands folded, voice measured, eyes slightly to the left of direct contact. "This is a standard process," Calloway said. "We take documentation issues seriously for everyone." "There's no documentation issue," Megan said. "Someone changed the entry. The investigation will determine it was altered after the fact. If you pull the system access logs..." "Megan." Calloway's voice changed slightly. A fraction softer, a fraction more careful. "I understand you're frustrated. The process will be thorough." Megan looked at her. Patricia Calloway was a decent physician administrator who had spent 20 years navigating institutional politics and had learned, the way most people in those positions learned, that certain fights were not winnable. Megan could see that she knew something was wrong. She could also see that this knowledge was not going to translate into action. She signed the administrative leave paperwork. She retrieved her personal items from the locker room. She walked out of Rivergate Medical Center at 1:14 in the afternoon, past the receptionist she'd said hello to 5 days a week for 2 years, past the lobby with Victor Hale's capital campaign framed on the wall, past the front doors and into the cold Ashford afternoon. Her hands were steady. She called Priya from the parking lot. "They put me on leave," she said. A silence. Then, "Victor Hale." Megan didn't answer. "I've been hearing things," Priya said carefully. "For a few months, little things, supply orders that don't match deliveries, budget line items that get relabeled. I didn't think..." She stopped. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine." "What are you going to do?" Megan looked at the hospital entrance. A family was coming out, a couple in their 40s and a teenager who was walking on his own, which meant he'd been an inpatient and now he was leaving, and the mother had her hand on his back. "I need a few days," Megan said. She spent the rest of the afternoon at her kitchen table. She was not panicking. Panic was a physiological state she had some experience managing, and this, an altered timestamp, an administrative leave, a CEO, who'd seen her face in a corridor, did not clear the threshold. She had been in situations that cleared the threshold. This was not one of them. What this was a problem with a structure to it. Someone with system access and sufficient authority had altered her chart entry. That required either admin-level access to the EHR or knowledge of her login credentials, which meant either IT was involved or someone had accessed her workstation when she wasn't at it, which she could reconstruct from her movements that day. The question was who had that access, and who'd authorized it, and whether there was a trail. She ate dinner, she went to bed. At 11:22 p.m., she heard something outside her apartment door. Not a knock, not footsteps approaching. A sound she didn't immediately classify. Small, deliberate. And then silence. She was on her feet before she'd fully processed it, barefoot, moving to the side of the door rather than toward it, back to the wall. She stayed there for 15 seconds. Nothing. She looked through the peephole. Empty hallway. The light at the far end was out. It had been working this morning. She went back to bed. She didn't sleep for a long time. The next morning, she drove to the Ashford field office of the Department of Health and Human Services. She had no appointment. She asked for someone in the Office of Inspector General Division and was told they'd need to schedule a callback. She gave her number and her name and said it was related to a large-scale financial fraud at Rivergate Medical Center. And she watched the receptionist's expression shift almost imperceptibly as she wrote it down. She was back in her car by 10. Her phone rang at 10:47. Unknown number. She answered it this time. Ms. Hart. The voice was male, measured, unhurried. Not threatening, which was sometimes its own kind of threat. "I think we should talk." "Who is this?" "A friend of Mr. Hale's. Someone who'd like to help you understand the situation clearly before you make any decisions you can't reverse." Megan looked out her windshield at the parking lot. "I've already made them," she said, and ended the call. She sat there for a moment. Then she drove back toward Rivergate, not to the main entrance, but to the employee lot on the building's north side, where the auxiliary maintenance entrance fed into the lower corridor near the loading dock. She'd worked this building for 2 years. She knew its rhythms, its quiet hours, It's camera coverage. She needed to get back into her unit. Specifically, she needed to get to the nursing station workstation she'd been using for the past week, before whoever had altered her chart entry had the chance to do anything else to it. She was 12 feet from the maintenance entrance when the door swung open from inside. Victor Hale stepped out. Not security, not an intermediary. Victor himself, in his suit, with his silver hair and his hands loose at his sides, the same posture as the corridor, the same careful calm. And behind him, a pace back, was Dale Pruitt. Victor looked at her and something moved behind his eyes. Something that had finished calculating. "Megan," he said, very quietly, "you shouldn't have come back." She took one step backward, and her heel hit the curb, and she registered, in the precise fraction of a second that certain training produces, that Pruitt had moved to her left, cutting off the angle to the parking lot, and Victor's right hand was moving toward the interior of his jacket. She turned and ran. The first shot was louder than she expected, which was always the case when you hadn't been in the field for 2 years, when your body had let itself remember what ordinary sounds were supposed to sound like. It hit the brick wall to her right. The second came as she turned the corner of the building and felt the impact before she understood it, a white-hot line across her left side, low below the ribs. And she went down onto one knee on the pavement and was back up in the same motion because the alternative was not acceptable. She made it to the north parking structure. She made it to the stairwell. She got up one flight and through the door, and she was pressing her hand against her left side, and the blood was soaking through her scrub top. She'd been wearing scrubs. She'd driven here in scrubs, out of habit. And she was trying to calculate how bad this was, how much time she had, whether the bullet had hit anything structural, or whether this was muscle and fascia, which she'd seen survive, which people had survived, which she had helped people survive before. She pulled out her phone and was dialing before she'd consciously decided to. The call connected on the second ring. "Priya," she said, and her voice was steady. She kept her voice steady. "I need you to listen to me carefully." She could hear Priya's breathing change. "Megan, what happened?" "Victor Hale just shot me," she said. "I need you to call 911. I'm in the north parking structure at Rivergate, second level, and I need you to tell them—" She stopped, breathed through it. "Tell them to send whoever's in charge of the OIG tip I filed this morning. Tell them the name is Victor Hale." "Oh my, Megan, I'm okay," she said. "I need you to make the call." She ended it. She sat against the concrete wall with her hand pressed hard against her side and listened to the sound of her own breathing, which was elevated but not catastrophic, and the distant sound of a car alarm somewhere below and somewhere farther, muffled, interior, the sound traveling through concrete and steel. Voices. One of them was Victor Hale's. He was still in the building. She heard the stairwell door at the bottom of the structure open, and then footsteps, and then silence, and her hand tightened against the wound, and she did not move, did not make a sound, and waited. The footsteps stopped at the first landing. Megan didn't breathe. She was pressed against the inner wall of the second level, back flat, knees bent, the concrete cold through her scrub top. Her hand was still hard against her side, and the blood had soaked through to her palm, and she could feel her pulse in the wound. Not pain exactly, more like a deep mechanical pressure, the kind that meant the body was doing what it was supposed to do, and hadn't yet decided how serious this was going to get. Below her, someone exhaled. A shift of weight, a shoe on concrete. Dale Pruitt's voice came up through the stairwell, low, meant to carry only as far as it needed to. "She's not on one. I'm going up." A muffled response. She couldn't hear Victor from here. That meant he wasn't in the stairwell, he was outside, or at the structure's entrance, controlling the perimeter the way someone controlled it when they'd done this before, or had thought very carefully about how they would do it if they ever needed to. She moved. Quiet, controlled, staying low, moving away from the stairwell door and toward the vehicle ramp that connected the second level to the third. There were cars up here, maybe a dozen, mostly employee vehicles, and she knew some of them because she'd parked next to them for 2 years. She got behind a dark blue pickup truck and stayed down. The stairwell door opened. Pruitt came through it the way a man came through a door when he was trying to be careful, but wasn't quite trained enough to do it correctly. Too much hesitation, too much looking left before right, too visible in the space. Megan watched him from under the truck's running board, tracked his feet, watched him move toward the far side of the level, away from her. Her phone was in her hand. She had it on silent. No light from the screen. She pulled up Priya's number and sent a text instead of calling. Second level. Pruitt here. Is anyone coming? The response took 40 seconds that felt longer. 911 called. Coming. How bad? She looked at her hand against her side. The blood had slowed some. That was either good, pressure working, nothing major hit, or it was the kind of slowing that happened when the body started rationing. She'd seen both. She'd learned, a long time ago, not to decide which one it was until she had more information. Manageable, she typed. Tell them Pruitt is armed. Hospital security. He's with Hale. She sent it and put the phone away. Pruitt was moving back toward the center of the level now, slower, and she could see from his posture that he hadn't found anything and was beginning to wonder if she'd gone up instead of staying. That uncertainty was useful. Uncertainty made people hesitate, and hesitation was the space she needed. The distant sound of a siren reached her from somewhere east of the building. One unit, then a second. Pruitt heard it too. She saw his head come up. And for a moment he stood completely still, calculating the same thing she was. How long and from which direction? He made his decision faster than she expected. He went back to the stairwell, not running, moving quickly but controlled, and the door swung shut behind him. Megan waited 10 seconds. Then she moved. She went up the ramp to the third level, not because the third level was safer, but because the structure's third level had an elevated walkway that connected to the hospital's administrative wing, a covered pedestrian bridge on the building's second floor, something she'd used exactly twice, both times with a patient transport. And the walkway had a glass panel wall that faced the north parking lot. If she could get to the walkway, she could see the lot below. She could see the entrance. She could see where Victor was and how many people were with him. She also needed to stay upright long enough for the sirens to arrive. The walkway door was unlocked. It was keyed from the hospital side, but the parking structure side had a simple lever handle, and she pushed through into the bridge and immediately felt the warmth of it compared to the concrete structure. The walkway was narrow, lit by recessed panels, and empty. Through the glass, she could see the north lot below. Victor Hale was standing near the maintenance entrance. He had his phone pressed to his ear, and his posture was different now. Less controlled, something working in his jaw. And beside him was not Pruitt, but a second man she didn't recognize, heavy-set, standing with his back to the building's wall. 2 units. 3. She could see the lights now, blue and red, strobing at the parking structure's main entrance on the far side of the building. Victor looked up. Not at the walkway specifically, but up, in the general direction of the structure's upper levels. And for a moment his face was fully visible in the lot's overhead light. He still looked calm. That was the thing that stayed with her, that had stayed with her since the corridor. The calmness. Not the gun, not the shots, but the fact that pulling a weapon in a hospital parking structure in broad daylight had not, even briefly, altered his expression. She lowered herself to sit against the walkway wall, below the line of the glass panels, and pressed both hands against her side and thought very carefully about her breathing. The wound was in her left flank, low. She'd assessed it as best she could with one hand and inadequate light. Entry wound, no obvious exit, which meant the bullet was still in there somewhere, and she wasn't going to be able to tell from outside her own body what it had hit on the way. The pain had arrived properly now, no longer just pressure, and she moved through it the way she'd learned to move through physical extremity. Acknowledge it. Don't argue with it. Don't let it run the room. She was still thinking clearly. That was the marker that mattered. Voices from below. Not from the lot, but from somewhere inside the hospital's administrative wing, on the other side of the door at the far end of the walkway. She heard a radio crackle. Then footsteps, multiple sets, moving quickly. The door at the far end of the walkway opened. The first person through was not police and not hospital security. It was Dr. Ethan Brooks, Rivergate's chief of surgery, in his white coat with a stethoscope around his neck, and the expression of someone who had received information he was still processing. Behind him was a uniformed Ashford PD officer, hand on his sidearm, and behind the officer was another one. Brooks saw her immediately. He crossed the walkway in 6 strides and dropped to one knee in front of her, and his hands were already moving, pulling back the hand she had pressed against her side, assessing, doing what surgeons did when they encountered a clinical problem, regardless of how that problem arrived. "How long ago?" he said. 15 minutes. He pulled back her scrub top enough to look at the wound properly, and his face did the thing faces did when they were processing clinical information without letting the processing show. Careful blankness, fast eyes. "Bullets in there." "I know." "Can you walk?" "I walked up here." He looked at her directly for the first time, not at the wound, but at her face. Ethan Brooks was 47, a tall man with a careful demeanor and the particular reserve of someone who'd spent decades in high-pressure surgical environments. She'd been in his OR twice as a circulating nurse. He was precise, efficient, and difficult to read. "Victor Hale shot you," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." Something moved across his face. She watched it come and go. "I saw him in the lot," Brooks said, "coming out. I was in the administrative wing, and I looked out the window, and—" He stopped. "I've known Victor for 11 years. "That's not relevant right now," Megan said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he got to his feet and turned to the officer. "I need a stretcher up here, and I need OR2 prepped immediately. You tell them it's a GSW, single entry, left flank, indeterminate trajectory, and someone needs to find where Hale is right now." "Sir, we have units." "Find him," Brooks said, and the steadiness in his voice left no room for discussion. They moved her on a stretcher through the administrative wing corridor and into the elevator, and she watched the ceiling panels pass and kept her breathing measured and thought about the OIG tip she'd filed and whether the information she'd given the receptionist was enough specificity, enough of a trail, if she didn't get the chance to give it again. She thought about the phrase Victor had used. The care didn't visibly degrade. $11 million taken from patient care funds. Managed metrics. A foundation account structured specifically to avoid federal audit thresholds. And now a hospital CEO standing in a parking lot having just fired a weapon at a nurse because she'd been in the wrong corridor at the wrong time. She thought, he's done this before. Not necessarily this, not the gun, but the removing of problems. The altered timestamp was too fast. Too clean. Someone in IT had made that change within hours of Victor seeing her face. That wasn't improvised. The elevator opened. The OR hallway was bright and purposeful, and she could hear someone on the PA calling a prep team, and she registered distantly that the clinical part of her brain was observing everything with professional detachment. The angle of the OR lights, the prep team assembling at the scrub sink, the anesthesiologist she recognized as Dr. Camila Osei, moving to meet the stretcher with the particular focused calm of someone good at their job. "Megan Hart," Osei said, getting the name from the officer who'd come down with them. "Allergies? Penicillin class, documented in my file." "Okay." Osei was already checking her pressure, her pulse ox. "I'm going to take care of you." "I know," Megan said. "Don't let them take me to recovery without a detective in the room." Osei looked at her. "A detective," Megan repeated. "When I wake up, I need someone in that room." "I'll make sure." They put her under at 11:54 a.m. She didn't dream. Or if she did, she didn't carry it back. What happened in the building while Megan was in surgery took several hours to fully reconstruct. And the reconstruction was complicated by the fact that multiple things happened simultaneously in a way that institutions are not designed to accommodate. Victor Hale was placed in custody at 11:41 a.m. in the north parking lot. The arresting officer was a 14-year veteran of the Ashford PD named Sergeant Donna Okafor, who had responded to a report of shots fired at a medical facility and arrived to find a well-dressed man standing calmly near a maintenance entrance, while two of his associates tried to explain to a different officer that there had been some kind of misunderstanding. Okafor had listened to approximately 12 seconds of the misunderstanding before asking Victor Hale directly whether he discharged a firearm in the last 30 minutes. Victor had said, "I'd like to call my attorney." Okafor had taken this as the answer it was. Dale Pruitt was located on the first level of the parking structure and taken into custody separately, which was operationally useful because it meant neither man knew what the other was saying. The second man from the lot, the heavyset one Megan had seen standing against the wall, was identified from hospital visitor logs as a man named Craig Solano, who worked for a private consulting firm that, within 3 hours, an investigative reporter from the Ashford Register would connect to Victor Hale's personal financial holdings. Solano requested a lawyer before any question was fully asked, and then sat in silence with an expression of someone who had prepared for this possibility and was now living inside it. Inside Rivergate, the 14 hours that followed Victor's arrest were the kind of hours that happen when an institution's leadership structure collapses faster than the institution can adapt. The board chair, a man named Howard Kellum, issued a holding statement that satisfied nobody. The CFO went home ill at noon and did not return calls. 3 administrators who had worked directly under Victor submitted requests for legal counsel by 3 p.m., which is itself a kind of statement. Ethan Brooks spent 4 hours in surgery and then another 2 speaking with investigators. And the picture that emerged from those conversations, partial, careful, offered in the precise language of a man choosing each word with awareness of its weight, was of a senior administrator who had known or suspected and had made the choice that people inside institutions make when the institution is the source of their livelihood and their identity. The choice to look at the available information and decide it wasn't enough to act on. He didn't say it in those words. The investigators heard it anyway. What Brooks did say, unambiguously, was what he'd seen when he looked out his administrative wing window and saw Victor Hale standing in the north lot. He said the expression on Victor's face, that particular calm, had told him something he'd been refusing to let himself know for longer than he wanted to admit. "I've seen Victor manage situations," Brooks told the detective. "I've watched him manage board members, manage liability, manage the press. He has a face he uses for it. He was wearing that face in the parking lot, after shooting a nurse." Brooks paused. "That's not a man who lost control. That's a man who made a decision." The detective, whose name was Rosa Ferris, 38 years old, 11 years in the Ashford PD, the kind of investigator who asked short questions and then went quiet and waited, wrote this down without comment. "Was she important to him as a target?" Ferris asked. "Or just convenient?" Brooks thought about it. "She was dangerous to him. There's a difference." Ferris wrote that down too. The OIG tip that Megan had filed that morning had, by early afternoon, escalated through the regional office to a point that surprised the Ashford field staff. Not the content of the tip, which was serious enough, but the speed of the escalation. This was partly explained at 4:17 p.m. when 2 federal investigators arrived at Rivergate, not from the OIG, but from a different agency entirely, one whose involvement nobody on the Ashford PD had anticipated, and whose presence required a brief jurisdictional conversation that Sergeant Okafor handled with more composure than the situation probably deserved. The federal investigators were interested in Rivergate Medical Center's financial records, specifically the foundation accounts and the disbursement structures Victor had referenced in the conference room. They were also, it emerged, interested in something else, something that connected to Megan Hart in a way that none of the Ashford officers had known to look for. They didn't explain what the connection was. Not yet. What they asked for were Megan Hart's personnel file, her employment history prior to Rivergate, and any records related to her administrative leave status. The HR director, Sandra Key, who had spent most of the afternoon in her office with the door closed, provided the personnel file in under 10 minutes. The prior employment history required more time, because what the file contained was not a gap, exactly, but a set of references and verification codes that the federal investigators recognized immediately and that required a separate set of phone calls that they made from a conference room that had been cleared of all Rivergate staff. Megan woke up at 6:48 p.m. She came back the way she usually came back from anesthesia, unevenly, in pieces, awareness arriving before sensation, and sensation arriving before she could fully respond to it. The room was dim. There was a monitor beeping in a steady, unremarkable rhythm that she recognized as her own heart. Her left side was bandaged and numb in the specific way of post-surgical local analgesia, which meant somebody had made a choice about her pain management that she had not been awake to influence. There was someone in the chair by the window. She turned her head, which took more effort than it should have. Detective Rosa Ferris was sitting with a notepad on her knee and a cup of coffee going cold in her hand, and she had the particular patience of someone who had been in that chair for a while and had decided the waiting was part of the job. "Ms. Hart," Ferris said. "Detective," Megan said. Her voice came out rougher than she expected. She cleared it. Victor Hale, in custody. Pruitt, also in custody. She breathed through the relief of that, which was minor and brief and did not prevent her from immediately moving to the next question. The OIG tip. Ferris set down her coffee. That's actually what I'm here to talk to you about. There's a lot to cover, and I want to be upfront with you. Some of what's happening around your case has moved faster and further than I expected, and I want to make sure I understand the sequence of events from your perspective before anyone else gets into this room. Who else is getting into this room? Federal investigators, 2 of them. They've been here since this afternoon, and they want to speak with you. Ferris paused. They're not OIG. I need you to know that. Megan looked at her. They know your personnel history, Ferris said carefully, from before Rivergate. I see. Do you want to tell me about it? Megan looked at the ceiling for a moment. The monitoring equipment beeped. Somewhere down the hall, a door opened and closed. I served 6 years as a combat medic, she said. Army. Deployments in 2 different conflict zones. My last 14 months were with a special operations unit in an advisory capacity. She kept her voice flat and informational. Most of what I did in that role is classified. Some of it isn't, but it's not well documented publicly. She paused. Victor Hale saw a nurse in a corridor. That's all he knew he was dealing with. Ferris was quiet for a moment. And that was an incorrect assessment. Very. Okay. Ferris made a note. Walk me through yesterday morning, from when you arrived at the building. Megan walked her through it. She was thorough and sequential, and she did not editorialize. She gave Ferris the conference room conversation as precisely as she remembered it. The phrasing, the numbers, the specific vocabulary Victor had used. She described the corridor encounter, Victor's face, the calculation she'd seen him making. She described the drive home, the unknown phone call, the parking lot light that had gone out. She described filing the OIG tip and the drive back to the hospital and the maintenance entrance and the moment the door opened. She kept her voice level throughout. Not because she felt level. There was something moving underneath the clinical recitation, something she wasn't going to examine closely in a hospital room with a detective present, but because levelness served the process and the process was what mattered now. Ferris took notes and asked short questions and went quiet and waited. She was good at this. Megan appreciated that. When it was done, Ferris reviewed her notes for a moment. You said the timestamp on your chart entry was off by 19 minutes, and that you didn't enter that timestamp. Correct. Can you tell me where you were during those 19 minutes? In the trauma bay. Admission from a highway rollover, splenic laceration. The attending was Dr. Yuri Vanek. The surgical team will have the OR record. Megan paused. Whoever altered my chart had admin-level access to the EHR or accessed my workstation while I was in the trauma bay. I was the only nurse assigned to that workstation that morning. If the system access logs haven't been cleared, the alteration will show up with a different user ID or a timestamp anomaly. Ferris looked at her with an expression that suggested she was recalibrating something. I know how documentation works, Megan said. It wasn't defensive, just a statement. I can see that. Ferris capped her pen. 2 federal investigators are going to want to speak with you tonight. I can be present if you want me to be. Yes. Is there anything you need before they come in? Megan thought about it. Water. And I want to know what they found in the foundation accounts. Ferris looked at her for a moment. I'll see what I can do on the second one. She went out. Megan lay in the dim room and listened to her own heart rate and thought about what Ferris had said. They know your personnel history from before Rivergate. That phrase had a specific shape to it. It didn't mean they'd found her service record in a personnel file. It meant they'd recognized the coding on it, the particular structure of verification references that indicated a certain level of clearance, a certain kind of work. That kind of recognition didn't come from a routine background check. It came from someone in the chain of investigators who dealt with that coding before, who knew what it meant, which meant this had already moved into a level she hadn't anticipated when she'd walked into the Ashford OIG field office that morning. She closed her eyes. She was tired in the specific way of post-anesthesia, combined with blood loss and sustained adrenaline, which was its own particular category of exhaustion. She did not sleep. She stayed in the space just below wakefulness and waited. The two federal investigators came in at 8:30 p.m. The first was a woman in her mid-40s, dark suit, a measured cadency to her movements that Megan recognized from people who'd done fieldwork and then moved into oversight roles. She introduced herself as Special Agent Diane Marsh. The second was a man who didn't introduce himself as anything in particular, gave his name as Garrett, and whose presence in the room had a different character than Marsh's. Quieter, less official in its register, the kind of presence that belonged to a different category of work. He sat slightly behind Marsh and to the side, and did not take out a notepad. Megan looked at Garrett. Garrett looked back. "You served with the 75th, he said. Not a question. "I'm not going to confirm or deny specifics in this room," she said. "Fair." He didn't push it. "Then I'll just tell you that we know what the commendations were for, and we know what the classification level is, and we know what it means that you're sitting here telling a story about $11 million instead of—" He paused. "Instead of not telling it." Marsh took over smoothly. "We've been conducting a parallel investigation into Rivergate's financial structure for 6 months. An anonymous informant flagged the foundation accounts in September. We were building the forensic picture when your OIG tip came in this morning, and then—" She gestured, a small economical gesture, toward the room in general. "The situation escalated." "The situation escalated because Victor Hale shot me," Megan said. "Yes." "Did you know it was going to escalate?" Marsh paused. It was a short pause, but it was there. "We didn't anticipate that he'd resort to direct physical—" "Did you know I was in the building?" Megan said. "Did your investigation have visibility into the administrative leave, the chart alteration, the sequence that started when he saw me in that corridor?" Another pause. Longer. "We had indicators that Hale was becoming more reactive," Marsh said. "We did not have specific intelligence about a threat to a hospital employee." Megan absorbed this. "Okay," she said. "What do you need from me?" They went through it for 90 minutes. Megan gave them everything. The conference room conversation, the precise language, the numbers, the references to the foundation accounts, and the reclassification and the federal reporting threshold. She gave it in the same sequential clinical manner she'd given it to Ferris, and Marsh took notes, and the man called Garrett mostly listened. And once, when Megan referenced a specific structural detail about how the disbursements had been described, he leaned forward slightly and she could see that something had connected. At 10 p.m., they wrapped. Marsh gathered her notes. "You're going to be asked to provide a formal statement," Marsh said, "and you should know that Victor Hale's legal team has already filed a preliminary motion to suppress, arguing that any statement you gave while under medical distress is inadmissible." "Let them file it," Megan said. "His attorney is Marcus Yate. He's expensive and he's very good. I know what I heard, and I know what I saw, and I'm not on medication that impairs my cognition." She paused. "And I was a combat medic for 6 years. I've been debriefed under worse conditions than this." Marsh looked at her. "Is there anything else we should know right now? Anything you think we haven't asked about?" Megan thought for a moment. "The man in the gray suit," she said. "In the conference room with Victor. Victor called him Salter. He said, 'Salter confirmed it this morning, about the third quarter adjustment.'" Marsh's expression shifted in a way she was clearly trying to control. "You're sure about the name?" "Yes." Marsh and Garrett exchanged a look, brief, contained, and Megan watched it and filed it. They know who Salter is, she thought. Salter is someone significant in whatever they've been building for 6 months. After they left, Ferris came back in. She stood by the door with her coat on and her notepad under her arm, and looked at Megan with the expression of someone who had just been present for something they were still processing. "You gave them Salter," Ferris said. "You know who he is." "Regional Director of the Midland Healthcare Foundation. He administers charitable grants across 4 states. Ferris paused. "He's also on the Governor's Health Advisory Council." Megan was quiet. "This got bigger than a hospital," Ferris said. "It was always bigger than a hospital," Megan said. $11 million moving through a foundation account structure doesn't stay in one building. Ferris looked at her for a moment, and in her expression Megan could see the particular recalibration of someone who had come into a case expecting one thing and was now holding something considerably heavier. "Get some rest," Ferris said. Tomorrow's going to be complicated. She went out. The door closed. Megan lay in the dim room, alone now for the first time in hours, and stared at the ceiling and listened to the monitoring equipment and thought about what Ferris had said. Tomorrow's going to be complicated. Yes. And the day after that. And the weeks after that, because whatever structure Victor had built, whatever network of accounts and allocations and political adjacencies had let $11 million move without a ripple. That structure did not belong to one man, and unwinding it was not going to be quick or clean or safe. She thought about Gerald Pitts in room 318, who had looked at her hands and said, "You're fast." She thought about the parking structure, the concrete floor, her own blood soaking through her palm. She thought about Victor Hale's face, calm in the lot light. Her monitoring equipment beeped. Her left side throbbed steadily under the analgesia. She was alive. She had given them Salter. She had given them the sequence, the language, the account structures, the name. She had given them everything she had, and it was going to be enough or it wasn't, and she would know which by how the next days unfolded. She was about to close her eyes when the door opened. Not Ferris, not a nurse. A figure she didn't immediately recognize. A woman in her 50s, civilian clothes, moving with the careful discretion of someone who had chosen this specific hour deliberately. She held up a badge before Megan could speak, a single clean motion. Federal. Not the same agency as Marsh and Garrett. "Ms. Hart," the woman said very quietly, "I'm Colonel Reyes. Retired." She lowered the badge. "I served with the people who supervised your last deployment. I need you to listen to me very carefully, because something has changed in the last hour, and if I don't tell you tonight, you're going to find out in a way that's harder to manage." Megan looked at her. "What changed?" she said. Colonel Reyes came further into the room and glanced back at the door, and then looked at Megan with the directness of someone who had decided that the easiest thing to manage was the truth. "Victor Hale's attorney filed more than a suppression motion tonight," she said. "He filed a motion to transfer jurisdiction. He's claiming that the financial operations in question were conducted under a federal contract structure, which would move this case to a federal docket and—" She paused. "And significantly limit the scope of what can be disclosed in open court." Megan went very still. "He's trying to classify the fraud," she said. "He's trying to use a federal contract designation to make significant portions of the financial record unavailable to state prosecutors." "Can he do that?" Colonel Reyes was quiet for a moment. "He has the right attorney," she said. "And he has, it turns out, some contract relationships with certain agencies that create legitimate ambiguity about jurisdiction." She paused. "Whether he can make it stick depends entirely on what the courts find compelling, and what the courts find compelling depends on whether the testimony that contradicts the motion is credible, on whether the witness who can testify to the conference room conversation is able to do so in a way that can't be undermined." Megan looked at the ceiling. She breathed. She thought about Marcus Yate, expensive and very good, and about the phrase federal contract designation, and about what it meant to try to use classification architecture to wall off a fraud case. She thought about $11 million, and the care didn't visibly degrade. She thought about the patients in every room of this building. Gerald Pitts with his central line, the woman from the highway rollover, the teenager she'd seen in the lobby going home, and what it meant that the money that should have been spent on their care had instead moved through a foundation and out to wherever it had gone. "Who else knows about the motion?" she said. "Marsh and Garrett? The Ashford DA's office. It'll be on the court docket by morning." "Then by morning the press will have it." "Yes." "And by morning," Megan said slowly, "Victor Hale's team will be arguing that the woman who overheard the conversation is an unreliable witness because she was on administrative leave for a documentation irregularity." She paused. "Which is what the altered timestamp was for. It wasn't just about getting me out of the building, it was about building a record, in case it ever got to a courtroom." Colonel Reyes looked at her for a long moment. "You understood that quickly," she said. "I understood it yesterday," Megan said. "In HR. When Sandra Key wouldn't look at me directly." She turned her head toward the window. It was full dark outside. The hospital lot was lit in yellow overhead light. "He planned for this." "Yes." which means he's planned for other things too. That's why I'm here, Reyes said quietly. Because the things he's planned for don't include what's in your service record. And tomorrow morning, when that motion hits the docket and his team starts working the narrative about who you are and what you heard, they're going to find out that the nurse in the corridor isn't quite what they assumed. Megan looked at her. What are you going to do with my service record? She said. Colonel Reyes reached into her jacket and set a single folded document on the bedside table. We're going to give it to the court, she said, with authorization to unseal the commendations. All of them. She held Megan's gaze. Victor Hale built his defense around the idea that a nurse overheard a private conversation and misunderstood what she was hearing. We're going to show the court exactly who was standing in that corridor. She left without waiting for a response. Megan looked at the folded document on the table. She didn't reach for it. She already knew what it said. She'd spent 2 years not talking about what it said, not because she was ashamed of it, but because carrying it into this version of her life had seemed like the wrong kind of weight. Victor Hale had made a very specific mistake. He had looked at her in that corridor and seen a nurse in scrubs and decided she was the kind of problem that could be managed with an altered timestamp and a gun. She closed her eyes. Outside, the night was quiet. In the morning, the court docket would open and Marcus Yates' motion would go public, and Victor Hale's legal team would begin the work of reframing who Megan Hart was and what she was worth as a witness. They would spend the night preparing. She would spend the night in a hospital room, alive, with a bullet still in her left flank and a service record that was about to stop being sealed. She thought she was probably not the one who should be worried. She was wrong. At 6:14 the next morning, Detective Ferris came through the door without knocking, which was the first indication that something had moved faster than expected. She was in the same clothes as last night, which meant she hadn't gone home. And she was carrying 2 coffees, which meant she was trying to manage whatever she was about to say. She set 1 coffee on the bedside table without comment and stood at the foot of the bed. Yates' motion was granted a preliminary hearing, Ferris said. 7 a.m., Judge Callum Pryor. I know who Pryor is. Then you know he's not friendly to federal overreach arguments. I know he's friendly to contract law, Megan said, which is what Yates is arguing. Not federal overreach, federal contract designation. Ferris absorbed this. Marsh is already at the courthouse. Is Reyes? I don't know who Reyes is officially, so I can't answer that officially. Ferris paused. The unsealing request went in at 5 this morning. That's what I can tell you. Megan pushed herself upright. Her left side pulled with it. A deep, hot drag that wasn't quite pain, not yet, more the body's way of reminding her that the surgical site was new and the local analgesia was wearing thinner by the hour. She breathed through it and reached for the coffee. I need to be at that hearing, she said. You were shot 14 hours ago. I know. I was there. She looked at Ferris. I need to be at that hearing. Ferris looked back at her for a long moment with the expression of someone calculating whether an argument was worth the energy. I'll get the attending, she said. The attending was a hospitalist named Dr. Marcus Felda, who arrived looking like a man who had been informed of a situation he did not entirely believe. He reviewed her chart, checked the surgical site, checked her vitals, and then stood at the foot of the bed with his arms crossed. The bullet nicked your external oblique and lodged against your iliac crest, he said. We got it out. You have 12 internal sutures and a drain. If you move wrong, you open the site. If you open the site and you're not here, you bleed. What's my pressure? Stable. Oxygen sat. 97. Then I'm ambulatory. Technically. Dr. Felde. She held his gaze. What I need to do this morning is more important than the risk of walking. If you need me to sign something, I'll sign it. He looked at her with the very specific expression that physicians reserved for patients who understood clinical parameters well enough to be informed and stubborn simultaneously. He was quiet for a moment. You sit, he said finally. Wheelchair to the car, you sit in the courtroom, you come back the moment anything changes. You feel lightheaded, you feel the drain shifting, you feel anything that isn't normal tired. You come back. Agreed. I mean it. I know you mean it. He left to write the discharge order, and Megan was pulling the IV line free with practiced efficiency when Ferris reappeared in the doorway. "There's something else," Ferris said. Megan looked at her. "The Ashford Register ran a story at 5:30, online. Someone leaked the chart alteration, the documentation irregularity, the HR meeting, all of it, and they ran it alongside the shooting." Ferris paused. "The headline is calling you a whistleblower who was put on leave and then shot. It's already been picked up by 2 national outlets." "Who leaked it?" "Working on it. But Megan," Ferris used her first name, which she hadn't done before. "Victor's legal team is already responding. They put out a statement at 6. They're saying you were under investigation for documentation fraud before you were shot, that you had a history of unstable performance reviews, and that your relationship with Dr. Brooks creates questions about the credibility of his account." Megan was quiet for a moment. "What relationship with Dr. Brooks?" "They're implying one. They're not saying anything specific. They don't have to. They just have to create enough noise that the hearing goes sideways." Ferris met her eyes. "This is what Yate does. He doesn't need to win on facts. He needs to win on uncertainty." Megan thought about this. She thought about it the way she thought about tactical problems. What's the terrain? What's the objective? What resources exist? What's the sequence? Victor had moved fast, which meant he was afraid. Afraid men made moves that were aggressive but not always accurate. The statement about her performance history was a fabrication that could be refuted with her personnel file. The implication about Brooks was a distraction designed to make him a less reliable witness and to make her look like she had a personal stake beyond what she'd actually said. The chart alteration story, though, whoever had leaked that had handed her something. "The story has the timestamp discrepancy," she said. "Yes." "Then someone with access to the HR records leaked documentation of the alteration itself." "Apparently." "That's someone inside Rivergate who wants this case to hold. That's someone who knows what happened." She paused. "Sandra Key." Ferris went still. "Sandra sat across that table from me," Megan said. "She knew what she was doing and she did it anyway, and she's been sitting with that for 18 hours. If she accessed the HR records last night and leaked them, then she's a witness," Ferris said. "Then she's a witness." The courthouse was a 20-minute drive through early Ashford traffic, and Megan sat in the back of Ferris's car with the pain medication the hospitalist had reluctantly approved, which took the edge off without taking her out, and watched the city go past the window. It was March in Colorado, and the morning light was flat and cold, and the streets were still mostly empty, and she thought about what Reyes had said the night before. They're going to find out the nurse in the corridor isn't quite what they assumed, and she thought about whether it would be enough. The federal contract designation was the real threat. If Yate convinced Judge Pryor that the Rivergate financial operations fell under a federal contract umbrella, significant portions of the documentary evidence went behind a classification wall that state prosecutors couldn't reach. It was elegant in a specific, ugly way, using the machinery of federal oversight to obstruct a case about federal funds being stolen. Victor had built this structure carefully and over time, which meant he'd anticipated exactly this scenario. The courthouse steps were occupied. Not a crowd. It was 7 in the morning, but enough people to register as something. 2 journalists she could see, a photographer, a group of men in suits near the entrance who moved with the purposeful calm of people who were paid to stand in courthouses. Ferris wheeled her in through a side entrance. The hearing room was small, wood-paneled, the kind of room that existed for procedural business rather than spectacle. Marsh was already seated at the prosecution table, and beside her was a lawyer from the DA's office named Sorensen, who looked young and had the focused expression of someone who had stayed up all night preparing. At the defense table, Marcus Yate was in a charcoal suit, and his posture communicated the specific relaxation of a man who believed he was going to win before the first word was spoken. Victor Hale was not in the room. He was in custody. But his absence didn't make the room feel empty. It made it feel precise, cleared down to the mechanism. And the mechanism was Yate. Ferris parked the wheelchair against the side wall and went to speak with Sorensen. Megan watched Yate reviewing his documents and thought about the 11 people who would eventually sit in a jury box and what they would see when they looked at her. Judge Pryor entered at 7:03. 61, deliberate in his movements, the kind of judge who made the courtroom feel like his property without having to say it. Motion by defense counsel to transfer jurisdiction on grounds of federal contract designation, Pryor said, settling into his chair. Mr. Yate? Yate stood. He was composed and measured, and he laid out the argument cleanly. Rivergate's federal grant relationships, the contract language that created what he characterized as federal operational authority over the facility's financial structures, the precedent for classification of financial records in cases involving federal contractors. It was good. Megan could see it was good. Sorensen argued against it, citing the state's independent criminal jurisdiction and the specificity of the charges, and cited 3 cases that partially supported the position and 1 that didn't, and Megan could see from his posture that he knew he was slightly behind. Then Marsh stood up. She laid the unsealing authorization on the judge's bench personally, which was unusual enough that Pryor's expression shifted slightly. She presented a summary of the federal investigation, 6 months, parallel track, independent forensic accounting, and she presented the timeline connecting Salter to the foundation accounts and the foundation accounts to 4 additional institutional partners in 3 other states. The scope of this investigation, Marsh said, does not support a single facility jurisdiction transfer. It supports federal prosecution of a network, of which Rivergate is 1 node. Defense counsel's motion functionally asks this court to classify evidence that belongs to a multi-state federal criminal case as the private business records of a federal contractor. That's not a jurisdictional argument. That's an evidence suppression tactic. Pryor looked at Yate. Counselor. Yate was on his feet smoothly. The federal investigation described by Special Agent Marsh does not negate, "I want to see the contract documents," Pryor said. The specific federal grant agreements that defense claims establish operational authority. I want them on my bench in 1 hour. Yate paused. Brief, small, but there. Your Honor, some of those documents— 1 hour, Mr. Yate. Megan watched Yate sit down and make a note and keep his expression controlled, and she could see, the way she could see things in people when she was paying attention, which was almost always, that something had shifted. The contract documents Yate needed to produce were either real and damaging to his own argument when examined closely, or they were structured in a way that depended on not being examined closely. Either way, 1 hour was not the timeline his strategy had been built around. The hearing recessed. Ferris appeared at her elbow. Marsh did well. She did, Megan said. But Yate will produce something. He always has something. What do you think he has? Megan looked at the defense table, where Yates' associate was on a phone, speaking low and rapid. I think, she said slowly, that he has a document we haven't seen. Something specific to my employment at Rivergate. She paused. He's had 18 hours to go through my personnel file. There's nothing in your file that— Not from before Rivergate. She turned to look at Ferris directly. From during. Something they manufactured, the same way they manufactured the timestamp. She felt the certainty of it settle in her chest, cold and precise. He asked for my personnel file yesterday afternoon. Sandra pulled it in under 10 minutes, and if someone inside Victor's network still has system access— Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. A text from an unknown number. 4 words. Check your employment record. She showed it to Ferris. Ferris's face went tight. They both looked at Yates' associate, still on the phone. And Megan understood, with the kind of clarity that arrived when a situation stopped being abstract, that Victor Hale had not used just one falsified document. He had built an entire architecture of them, patient, sequential, waiting, and somewhere in her personnel record, something new had appeared overnight that didn't exist yesterday morning. Something that was going to be on Pryor's bench in 53 minutes. Ferris moved first. She was on her phone before Megan finished processing the text, stepping away from the wheelchair and speaking low and fast into the receiver. And Megan sat with the phone in her hand and looked at the 4 words on the screen and thought about what specifically would be worth fabricating. Not a performance review. Those were too vague, too easy to contest. Not an attendance record. Something clinical. Something that would speak to competence or judgment or reliability in a way that felt documentable and specific. A medication error, maybe. Or a near-miss incident that had supposedly been internally flagged and suppressed. That was what she would build, if she were building it. Something that looked like Rivergate had caught a problem and quietly handled it rather than risk the publicity of a formal report. Something that made the suppression itself seem institutional and protective rather than fabricated. Ferris came back. Marsh is pulling the personnel file access logs right now. If someone got into the system overnight, they had access. They've had access since they altered the chart entry. The question is whether the log shows a timestamp on the new entry. Megan paused. And whether whoever made the entry was careful enough to backdate it. Can they backdate it? Depends on the EHR system and what admin privileges they had. Rivergate runs Metavance. I know the system. Backdating in Metavance requires a secondary authorization from a compliance officer, which should create its own record. She stopped. Unless the compliance officer is inside Victor's network. Is the compliance officer inside Victor's network? Megan thought about the past 2 years. She thought about the administrative structure, who reported to whom, which departmental heads she'd seen in closed-door meetings with Victor at hours that didn't match their stated functions. The compliance officer is a man named Alan Torr, she said. He came to Rivergate from Victor's previous hospital 18 months ago. I don't know what that means, but it's worth looking at. Ferris relayed this and went quiet, listening, and Megan watched the courthouse's side corridor and felt the drain in her left side shift with a small, precise discomfort that reminded her that she was a person who had recently been shot and was currently sitting in a legal proceeding on the strength of a hospitalist's reluctant discharge order. Sorensen came over from the prosecution table. He was younger than she'd initially thought, late 20s maybe, and he had the eyes of someone who'd been receiving bad news in pieces since 6 in the morning and was managing it through velocity. We've been informed defense may be presenting supplemental personnel documentation, he said. Do you know what it is? Not specifically. Best guess. Something clinical, an incident report that looks like it was internally managed rather than formally filed. It'll be structured to suggest that Rivergate had concerns about my clinical judgment and that those concerns were the real basis for the administrative leave. She looked at him directly. It won't exist in any system that was accessed before the night I was shot. If you pull the access logs and the creation timestamps, the fabrication will show. Sorensen looked at her for a moment. You're very clear-headed for someone 20 hours post-GSW. I'll take that as a compliment. He went back to the table. Ferris reappeared, and the expression on her face had shifted. Something had come in. Marsh has the access log, Ferris said quietly. Someone accessed Megan Hart's personnel file at 11:47 p.m. last night, 47 minutes after Yate filed the suppression motion. From whose credentials? Alan Torr's. There it was. Not surprising, but hearing it land made something solidify in Megan's chest. The particular solidity of being right about something you didn't want to be right about. He added a document, Ferris said, incident summary, dated 8 months ago, claims you administered the wrong dosage of heparin to a post-surgical patient and that the error was caught by a physician and managed internally. 8 months ago, I was working primarily with Dr. Vanek's trauma team. Every medication I administered in that period is in the chart record with physician cosign. The heparin orders especially. Vanek is meticulous about anticoagulation documentation because he had a patient outcome issue earlier in his career, and he doesn't let anything go unsigned. Megan paused. The chart records will contradict the incident summary at every specific point. Marsh is already pulling them. Good. And Tor, she's sending someone to his home address right now. Megan looked at the courtroom door. 41 minutes remaining in the recess. He'll run, she said. Maybe. He's been inside this long enough to know what a timeline looks like. He saw what happened to Victor yesterday. He knows the access log implicates him directly, and he knows we're going to find it. She met Ferris's eyes. He'll try to run. Ferris was back on the phone. What happened in the next 38 minutes was the kind of compressed institutional chaos that looked, from the outside, like a series of unrelated events, and was, from the inside, a single structure coming apart under pressure that had been building since the moment Victor Hale fired a gun in a hospital parking structure and created a witness instead of eliminating one. Alan Torr was located at his home at 7:31 a.m. with a packed bag in his car and a one-way flight to Phoenix departing at 10:15. The officer who arrived found him in his driveway. He did not attempt anything dramatic, No running, no confrontation. He sat on the hood of his car and put his hands flat on his knees and looked at the officer with the expression of a man who had done a calculation and arrived at the end of it. He asked for a lawyer within the first 30 seconds. Then, after approximately 90 seconds of silence, he said, "I want a deal." This information reached Marsh at 7:43 a.m., 17 minutes before the recess ended. She processed it, made 3 phone calls in rapid sequence, and at 7:58 she walked to the defense table and spoke quietly to Marcus Yates for exactly 45 seconds. Megan watched Yates' face from across the room. She watched the control he kept over it, which was considerable and professional. And she watched the single moment where the control slipped, just a fraction, just long enough to be visible to someone who was paying attention, and then reseated itself. Court resumed at 8 o'clock. Yates stood. "Your Honor, defense requests a brief continuance on the contract documentation." Pryor looked at him over his glasses. "You had an hour, Mr. Yates." "There have been some developments in the last hour that—" "I'm sure there have." Pryor set down his pen. "Motion for jurisdiction transfer is denied. The federal investigation described by Special Agent Marsh establishes a scope that does not support single facility transfer, and defense has not produced contract documentation sufficient to establish the operational authority claimed." He looked at both tables. "This case proceeds on the state criminal docket with federal coordination. Next appearance is set for—" He checked his calendar. "March 31st. We'll address the evidence framework then." He left the bench. The room reorganized. Megan sat in the wheelchair and felt something in her chest that wasn't quite relief. Relief was too simple for what had just happened. More like the particular sensation of a structure holding under load. Not comfortable, just intact. Sorensen came over. He looked slightly stunned, the way young lawyers looked when things moved faster than their preparation had accounted for. "Tor is in custody," he said. "He's asking for a cooperation agreement." "He should get one," Megan said. "He's going to give you the full account structure, the compliance sign-offs, the backdating protocols, which other records were altered, and when. He built those systems. He knows all of it." "You think he'll actually cooperate?" "He packed a bag last night and tried to fly to Phoenix. He's not a loyalist. He's an employee who got in too deep. That type cooperates." She paused. "But lock the agreement down before he talks to anyone connected to Victor's network. If Yates' people get to him first, the cooperation window closes." Sorensen looked at her for a moment with the expression she was beginning to recognize from multiple people in this building. The recalibration expression, the one that meant they were revising something about who she was. She was tired of watching people revise their assessments. She understood why they did it. She was still tired of it. Ferris wheeled her back through the side corridor and out to the car, and on the drive back to Rivergate, she sat with the window cracked, and the cold March air coming in and thought about what came next. The jurisdiction motion was dead. Tor was cooperating. The fabricated incident summary would be refuted by chart records that Vanek's documentation habits had made airtight. The case's evidentiary foundation was holding. What remained was the trial itself, which was not a small thing. Trials were their own terrain, with their own logic and their own vulnerabilities, and Marcus Yates was expensive and good, and he hadn't gotten where he was by losing preliminary hearings and giving up. He would rebuild. He would find different angles. He would take everything he had, the administrative leave, the implication about Brooks, whatever else he could construct, and he would bring it into a courtroom with a jury that didn't know Megan Hart and had no reason yet to trust her account over Victor Hale's money and lawyers and 47 years of built public credibility. She thought about what Reyes had said. "We're going to show the court exactly who was standing in that corridor." That wasn't enough on its own. A service record established credibility, but credibility wasn't the same as proof. The proof was in the conference room conversation, what she'd heard, the specific language, the numbers. And the proof that the conversation had occurred was in the financial records that Marsh's team had been building for 6 months, and that Tor's cooperation would now accelerate significantly. But there was still a gap. The gap was this. She had heard Victor say it, and Tor could confirm the financial structures, but the person in that conference room with Victor, the man in the gray suit, Salter, had not yet been charged with anything. And Salter, As a regional director of the Midland Healthcare Foundation with a seat on the governor's advisory council, had resources and relationships that could slow the process considerably if he chose to use them. She needed Salter to move. She needed him to do something that created a record, because a man like Salter moving was more damaging than anything a prosecutor could build from the outside looking in. She was back in her hospital room by 9. Dr. Felda came in at 9:20, checked the site, checked the drain, told her she'd done something inadvisable but that the numbers were acceptable. He said it with the particular resignation of physicians who had learned that some patients made decisions based on a hierarchy of values that placed clinical recommendations somewhere below the top. She thanked him. She meant it. Priya came at 10, off a night shift, still in her scrubs, and sat in the chair by the window and looked at Megan with red-rimmed eyes and the expression of someone who had been holding something tightly for a long time. "Sandra Key called me last night," Priya said. Megan looked at her. "She asked me if I thought you'd be willing to speak with her, off the record, before anything formal." Priya paused. "I think she wants to tell you something she didn't tell the investigators. She leaked the documentation irregularity to the register." Priya was quiet for a moment. "She said she'd been sitting with it since the day she called you into her office. She said she knew the file had been altered before you came in. Victor had called her that morning, before she'd even reviewed the record, and told her that there was a documentation issue with one of the trauma nurses and that it needed to be handled quietly through administrative leave." Priya's voice was careful. "She knew, Megan. She called you in and did it anyway." Megan absorbed this. She wasn't angry exactly. She understood it. The calculus of institutional survival, the way people made choices inside structures that were larger than them. That understanding didn't make it clean. Nothing about any of this was clean. "She needs to give a statement," Megan said. "Everything Victor said in that phone call, the exact words if she remembers them, the time, the context, everything." "She's scared." "I know. Tell her scared is fine. Scared and silent is the problem." Priya went to make the call. Megan looked at the ceiling. The case was a building, she thought. The foundation was the financial records Marsh had been compiling for 6 months. The walls were the witness testimony. Her account, Brooks's account, Tor's cooperation, Sandra Key's statement if it came, any of the other Rivergate staff who had seen pieces of this and stayed quiet because quiet felt survivable. The roof was the commendations, the service record, the thing Reyes had called showing the court who was standing in that corridor. Buildings didn't go up clean. They went up in sequence, and at every stage something was wrong. A measurement off, a material late, a crew member who made a decision that required rework. The question was whether you could catch it before it compromised the structure. She was thinking about this when her phone buzzed. "Marsh." She answered it. "Salter," Marsh said without preamble. "What did he do?" "He went to the governor's office at 8 this morning, showed up without an appointment, and requested a private meeting. Staff turned him away." He requested again. Staff turned him away again. A pause. At 8:40, he sent an email to the governor's chief of staff. "We have it." "How do you have it?" "Because the chief of staff forwarded it to the state attorney general's office at 8:45, and the AG's office called us at 9 o'clock. Another pause. Longer. Salter's email is an attempt to preemptively characterize the Rivergate investigation as politically motivated. He names the governor as a character reference for himself. He implies the governor has knowledge of the foundation's operations. Megan was quiet. "He panicked," she said. "He panicked badly. He just handed us the governor's office as either a witness or a co-defendant, and either way, that's not a small thing." "No," Megan said, "that's not a small thing." She ended the call and sat with the phone in her hand and thought about the shape of what Salter had done. A man who had spent his career inside institutional structures had, under pressure, done the thing that institutional people did when the pressure arrived faster than they'd planned for. He'd reached for his most powerful relationship and tried to use it as a shield. And in doing so, he'd drawn that relationship into the investigation's line of sight in a way that could not be undone. Victor had built carefully, over years, and it hadn't mattered. Tor had built carefully, and he was sitting in a holding facility asking for a cooperation agreement. Salter had panicked, in under 24 hours and implicated a sitting governor. This was what happened when you built something on the assumption that the person who heard you talking would not be able to stand up and tell anyone about it. You built for the scenario where the nurse stayed down. But then, the weeks that followed were not triumphant. They were procedural and grinding, and there were moments, more than a few, where the structure Megan had been mentally building felt like it was sagging under its own weight. The trial date was set for late May, which gave Yates time to rebuild his strategy without the jurisdictional argument. He built it around reasonable doubt and credibility, not attacking Megan's military record, which was now public and which any jury would find compelling, but attacking the chain of inference. She'd overheard a conversation. She'd interpreted it. Her interpretation was colored by her subsequent experience. The financial records were complex and required expert interpretation, and expert interpretations could be disputed. It was a competent strategy. She gave it that. Brooks testified at the preliminary hearings with the particular care of a man who had decided that accurate testimony was the only thing he had left to offer. He did not minimize his own failure, the not looking, the choosing not to know, and he did not perform remorse in a way that felt calculated. He told it straight and let the weight of it be what it was. Ferris told Megan afterward that his testimony had been the most effective of the preliminary phase, specifically because of the moments where he said things that hurt his own reputation. He didn't try to soften it, Ferris said. He's a surgeon, Megan said. They know when a prognosis is a prognosis. Sandra Key gave her statement. It took 2 sessions because the first one fell apart about 40 minutes in when she started crying in a way that was not performative, the kind of crying that came from somewhere older than the immediate situation, and the investigators gave her the space to get through it and came back the next day. What she gave them was specific and damning, Victor's exact words in the phone call. The instruction to handle it quietly. The way he'd said documentation issue in a tone that she understood to mean she should not ask follow-up questions. She also gave them something no one had asked for, a log she'd kept on her personal phone. Small notes, dated, going back 11 months. Not a formal record. She'd been keeping it for herself, she said, because she'd been sensing for almost a year that something was wrong and she'd wanted a record in case it ever became relevant. It was very relevant. Tor's cooperation agreement was finalized in the first week of April. What he gave the prosecution was comprehensive and technical, and in places, worse than anyone had estimated. The foundation accounts were not the only mechanism. There were vendor contracts. Supply agreements with companies that Tor could document were shell entities connected to a holding company that Victor controlled through 3 layers of subsidiary structure. The total diversion, once the forensic accountants worked through Tor's documentation, came to just under $18 million. Not 11. 18. The additional $7 million had moved through channels that Marcia's team hadn't found in 6 months of investigation because they'd been looking at the foundation accounts and the vendor contracts had been structured to look like legitimate supply chain expenses. When Megan heard this number, she sat with it for a while. $18 million. From a hospital. From the funds that were supposed to pay for patient care, staff training, equipment maintenance, the 1,000 small operational investments that kept a medical facility functional and safe. The care didn't visibly degrade, Victor had said. We managed the metrics. She thought about what that meant in practice, what you cut when you needed to hide $18 million in missing funds, but keep the outcome metrics from triggering scrutiny. You didn't cut the things that were measured. You cut the things that weren't. The extra training shift. The equipment replacement that could be deferred. The staffing buffer that absorbed the bad nights. You managed the metrics and you let the margin erode, and you told yourself it was administration, it was efficiency. It was what good management looked like. And somewhere in that eroded margin, someone had gotten care that was slightly worse than it should have been, and that someone didn't know why, and would never know why, because the why had been taken from them and moved into a foundation account, and then into a shell company, and then into Victor Hale's holding structure. She was thinking about this in the 3rd week of April when Ferris called with something new. Salter, Ferris said. What now? He flipped. Full cooperation. He retained separate counsel from Victor's team 3 weeks ago. We didn't know about the split until this morning, and his new attorney contacted the AG's office yesterday. Megan was quiet. What did the email do? She said. The one to the governor's chief of staff. His new attorney is arguing that Salter had no independent criminal intent, that he was responding to pressure from Victor's network and acted under what he characterizes as coercive influence. Ferris paused. It's not a strong argument, but it gave him a posture for the cooperation conversation. And the governor? The AG's office has opened a separate inquiry. The governor's people are cooperating fully and preemptively, which suggests they're scared but clean. Another pause. Or scared and smart enough to get in front of it. What does Salter give us? The conversation, Ferris said. He was in that room, Megan. He was the man in the gray suit. He's going to confirm everything you heard, corroborate the account structure, and testify that Victor had been running this for longer than 31 months. He says it started in year 2 of Victor's tenure. 6 years. 6 years. She sat down. 6 years of managed metrics and eroded margins and patients who'd received slightly less than they should have because the money had somewhere else to be. He'll testify at trial, Ferris said. It wasn't a question. Yes, Megan said. He will. The trial began on May 23rd. The courtroom was not the small procedural room from the preliminary hearing. It was Ashford County's main criminal courtroom, high-ceilinged, wood-paneled, the kind of room that had absorbed decades of consequential moments and retained a specific gravity because of it. The gallery was full on the first day. Journalists, hospital staff, community members, a row of people Megan didn't recognize who turned out to be from a patient advocacy organization that had been tracking Rivergate's financial irregularities for 2 years without knowing what they were actually tracking. Megan sat at the prosecution table in a gray blazer over a white shirt, her posture straight, her left side still carrying the deep ache that Dr. Felde had told her would probably persist for another 2 months. She looked like herself. Not a hero, not a victim, not the figure that 2 national outlets had constructed from the initial story. Just a woman in a gray blazer who had been in the wrong corridor at the right time and had made a series of decisions after that. Yates' opening statement was precise and professional and built the frame he'd been constructing since the jurisdiction motion died. A complex financial situation, genuinely interpreted differently by different parties. A witness whose account was filtered through trauma and injury. A client who had made a catastrophic error in judgment on one day that should not be allowed to override years of demonstrated service to his community. He did not mention the gun as a mistake. He mentioned it as a moment of panic from a man who had never faced this kind of pressure. The word panic landed, and Megan looked at the jury. 12 people, ages ranging from probably late 20s to mid-60s, a mix that Sorensen had worked carefully during selection. And she watched their faces absorb the word. She thought about the north parking lot, Victor's face in the overhead light, that particular calm. Her testimony was scheduled for day 3. She spent the first 2 days listening to the forensic accountants, to 2 Rivergate staff members who testified to the supply chain irregularities, to a Midland Healthcare Foundation employee who had flagged concerns internally 8 months ago and been told by Salter that the issue had been reviewed and resolved. On the morning of day 3, she was in the corridor outside the courtroom when she heard raised voices from inside. Not argument level, more the kind of controlled disturbance that happened when something procedurally unexpected occurred. She looked at Sorensen. What is that? Sorensen had his phone out reading something. His expression shifted. Yates just filed a last-minute motion. New evidence. What evidence? He's presenting a witness statement. Sorensen looked up. A former Army officer who served during the same period as you. He's claiming this witness will testify that your classified commendations were, and I'm quoting the motion, procedurally anomalous and potentially the result of documentation irregularities within the military administrative system. Megan stared at him. He's challenging your service record, Sorensen said. He found someone to say your commendations aren't what they appear to be. She looked at the courtroom door. She thought about Reyes. We're going to show the court exactly who was standing in that corridor. And she thought about the unsealed record and the authorization documents on the bedside table, and she thought, this is the move he had left. This was always the move he had left. Not the finances, not the chart, not Brooks. This. Attack the record. Attack the soldier. Make the jury wonder if the woman they're being asked to trust built her credibility on something that was itself false. She thought about how much it had cost Victor Hale to find someone willing to make that claim under oath. She thought about what kind of pressure or payment would move a former military officer to walk into a courtroom and say that a decorated veteran's record was fraudulent. She thought about Colonel Reyes, who had said, "I served with the people who supervised your last deployment," and who had left a folded document on her bedside table, and who had chosen a specific hour of the night to deliver specific information in a specific way. She looked at Sorensen. "Get Reyes on the phone, right now." "I don't have—" "Marsh does." She was already moving toward the courtroom door. "Get Marsh. Tell her Yate has a witness attacking the service record, and tell her we need Reyes in this building today." She pushed through the door. The courtroom noise settled as she entered, and she walked to the prosecution table and sat down. And she was aware of the jury watching her arrive, and she kept her posture level and her expression clear, and she thought, 11 years ago, she had been in a position considerably more dangerous than this. She had made decisions under considerably worse conditions than this. She had done it without anyone watching, without any recognition, without any record that would ever be publicly accessible. Victor Hale had tried to make sure it stayed that way. She looked at him across the courtroom. He was in a dark suit, flanked by his legal team, and he was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not the parking lot calm, not the administrative certainty. Something else. Something that was working hard to be nothing. She looked at him until he looked away. The judge called the room to order. Yate rose to present his motion. Sorensen was on his feet to object. The procedural machinery of it engaged, voices and counter-voices, the careful formal language of a system that moved slowly and deliberately and was, in its own grinding way, the only structure available for what needed to happen here. And in Megan's jacket pocket, her phone buzzed once. A text from an unknown number. Different unknown number than before. "I'm in the building. Tell Sorensen to buy 20 minutes. She looked at the message. She looked at the sender field, which told her nothing. She thought about Reyes standing in the dim hospital room with her badge held up in a single clean motion. "I served with the people who supervised your last deployment." She passed the phone under the table to Sorensen without looking at him. She heard him breathe in sharply. 20 minutes was not a long time. 20 minutes was also, in the right circumstances, exactly enough. Sorensen read the text twice. Then he did what she'd asked. He rose and requested 20 minutes on grounds of reviewing the procedural basis of Yates' motion, citing the late filing timestamp and the absence of prior disclosure. Judge Pryor looked at him with the expression of a man who was aware he was being asked to pause something without being told why, and who was deciding whether his patience extended that far. It extended that far. Barely. 20 minutes, Pryor said. Use them. The room reorganized. Yate huddled with his associate. Sorensen stepped out and Megan followed him into the corridor, moving at a pace her left side protested and she ignored, and they stood near the far wall and Sorensen said very quietly, "Who sent that?" "Someone who can answer Yates' witness." "That's not an answer. It's the answer I have right now." She looked down the corridor. It was empty except for a court officer at the far end and a woman she didn't recognize sitting on a bench near the building's main entrance, looking at nothing in particular in the way that people looked at nothing in particular when they were in fact paying attention to everything. The woman was in her late 50s. Civilian clothes, some dark slacks, a plain jacket, the kind of outfit that communicated nothing and therefore communicated something. She had the posture of someone who had spent years in rooms where posture mattered and had stopped thinking about it consciously. She looked up and met Megan's eyes. She stood. She wasn't Colonel Reyes. Megan didn't know her, but she crossed the corridor with the directness of someone who knew exactly who Megan was. And when she reached them, she didn't offer her hand. She said, "I'm General Harriet Vaughn, retired. I was the commanding officer of the unit your last deployment supported." Megan looked at her. "You were never supposed to be public," Vaughn said. "It wasn't an apology. It was a statement of fact. The work you did was classified because it needed to be, and I signed off on keeping it that way because that was the right call at the time." She paused. "It's not the right call anymore?" "Yate has a witness," Megan said. "Former officer, claiming my commendations were administratively irregular." "I know." Vaughn's voice was flat. His name is Robert Fenner. He was a logistics coordinator who processed paperwork in a regional command office and never served in a forward environment in his career. He has a civil judgment against the Army from 2019 that he lost. And he has, she paused, connections to a consulting firm that received $340,000 from a holding company linked to Victor Hale's asset structure in the last 8 weeks. Sorensen made a sound. He was paid, Megan said. He was paid, Vaughn confirmed. I have the financial documentation. My office has been tracking Victor Hale's asset movement since the federal investigation began, because one of his shell company structures had a contract relationship with a defense logistics firm that we had separate concerns about. She looked at Megan directly. I can testify to Fenner's background, his lack of operational knowledge, and the payment structure. I can also testify, with authorization I received this morning, to the specific nature and circumstances of your commendations. On the record, Megan said, in open court. On the record, in open court. Vaughn paused. I want you to understand what that means. Some of what I describe will be the first public acknowledgement that certain operations occurred. That's a decision that goes above my pay grade, even retired. And it was made this morning by people who decided that letting a paid witness undermine a decorated veteran's record in a public courtroom was a worse outcome than limited disclosure. She paused again. I agree with that decision. I want you to know I agree with it. Megan looked at her for a moment. She thought about 6 years that had been, by design, unwitnessed. She thought about the specific loneliness of doing important work in conditions of total invisibility, and then building a new life in which that work was a gap on a resume and a habit of situational awareness that made people slightly uneasy in her presence. Okay, she said. Okay, Vaughn said. They went back inside. What happened in the following hour was the kind of courtroom moment that people who were present described differently, depending on who they were and what they had expected walking in. The journalists in the gallery wrote about it in terms of drama and revelation. The legal observers wrote about it in terms of procedural sequence and evidentiary weight. The jury, the 12 people who were the only audience that mattered, experienced it in the way that human beings experience the moment when a picture they thought they understood revealed itself to be something else entirely. Yate presented Fenner first. Fenner was a trim man in his 60s with good posture and rehearsed composure, and he testified with the confidence of someone who had been told that his performance today would be worth the money. He characterized the commendations process as irregular, cited specific administrative codes, and implied that field commendations in certain classified contexts were often issued without proper oversight review. He was credible enough, in the way that paid credibility was credible, polished on the surface, internally hollow. Sorensen cross-examined. He didn't attack Fenner directly. Instead, he walked him through his service record, his assignments, the specific locations where he'd served, the proximity of those locations to any forward operational environment. Fenner answered. The answers were what Vaughn had described. A logistics man, a paperwork man, a man who had processed documents in regional offices and never been closer to a forward deployment than a secure briefing room. Have you ever received a field commendation yourself? Sorensen asked. No. Have you ever recommended a field commendation? No. Have you ever been present in an environment where the conduct being commended was occurring? Fenner paused. Not directly. Not directly, Sorensen said, and left it there. Then Vaughn took the stand. She stated her name, her rank, her years of service. She stated that she had commanded the unit whose work Megan Hart had supported during her final deployment. She stated this without flourish and without the particular performative humility that sometimes accompanied high-rank testimony. She stated it the way she stated everything, as fact, because that was what it was. When Sorensen asked her about the commendations, she described them, not vaguely, not in administrative language that obscured the actual events. She described them in the specific, tactile language of someone who had been there. The conditions, the timeline, the nature of the emergency, what Megan had done, and what the outcome had been for the people she'd helped, and what it would have been if she hadn't been there. The courtroom was very quiet. Megan sat at the prosecution table and looked at the surface of the table and breathed evenly. She had not heard anyone describe those events out loud before. She had written reports. She had filed documentation. She had answered questions in classified debrief sessions with people who understood the context and needed the operational detail. She had not sat in a room and listened to another person describe what she had done in the plain language of what it actually was. It was harder than she expected. She kept her face still. Vaughn described the financial documentation connecting Fenner to Victor Hale's holding structure. She laid it out in sequence. The consulting firm, the payment dates, the dollar amounts, the entity chain. Yate objected twice. Both objections were overruled. Then Vaughn looked at the jury and said something that was not in Sorensen's prepared questions. "I've testified in a lot of proceedings," she said. "I've given classified testimony, operational testimony, personnel testimony. In all of it, I've tried to say what was true and leave out what wasn't relevant." She paused. "What's relevant here is that the woman sitting at that table did her job under conditions that most people in this room cannot fully imagine, and she did it without any expectation of recognition. And then she came home and built a quiet life and did a different job the same way. Carefully, precisely, without asking anyone to notice." Another pause. Victor Hale noticed. He noticed she was in a corridor where she shouldn't have been, and he decided she was manageable. He was wrong about that. He has been wrong about her at every single decision point. I think the jury should understand exactly how wrong. Pryor did not strike it. He looked at Yate as if inviting an objection, and Yate was still for a moment, and the moment passed. Vaughn stepped down. Megan testified that afternoon. She had been through the sequence so many times now, in hospital rooms, in investigators' offices, in preliminary hearings, that she could have delivered it mechanically, and the temptation was real because mechanical was safe. Mechanical didn't have edges that caught on things. But she didn't deliver it mechanically. She delivered it the way it had actually happened, which meant it had texture and imperfection. She admitted that she'd hesitated in the corridor instead of walking immediately. She admitted that she'd gone back to the hospital the next morning, partly because she was angry and partly because she wasn't sure what else to do. She said she'd been scared in the parking structure, not as a confession, not as a plea for sympathy, just as a true thing that was part of the sequence. "He fired twice before I made the corner," she said. "The second one hit me. I knew it had hit me and I kept moving because the alternative was not acceptable." A juror in the second row, a woman in her 40s who had said during selection that she worked in healthcare administration, was looking at Megan with an expression that had moved past active evaluation into something quieter. Yates' cross was careful and controlled, and he found the edges he'd been looking for. The imprecision in her initial OIG report, the fact that she'd returned to the hospital before involving law enforcement, the question of whether her prior military training might have affected her perception of threat level. He wasn't brutal. He didn't need to be brutal. He just needed to insert enough uncertainty that 12 people would spend deliberation time on it. He asked her, near the end, whether she had any personal animosity toward Victor Hale prior to the events in question. She looked at him. "I didn't know Victor Hale prior to those events. I'd been in the same room as him twice in 2 years. And yet you made the decision to report him immediately." "I made the decision to report what I heard. Yes. Immediately. The next morning. You slept on it first. I assessed the situation and took action when I was confident in what I had." She paused. "That's what you do when the stakes are high. You don't move until you're sure you're right." Yate let that land and moved on, and she could see from the slight adjustment in his posture that it had landed in a direction he hadn't intended. The prosecution's closing took 40 minutes. Sorensen was thorough and he was good, better than she'd given him credit for early in the process. And he built the argument the way a structure should be built. Foundation first, the financial records and Tor's testimony, then the walls, the witness accounts, and the fabricated documentation and what the fabrication itself revealed about intent. Then the commendations and Vaughn's testimony as context, not for sympathy, but for accuracy. This is who she is. This is what her account is worth. This is what it means that Victor Hale looked at her in that corridor and made the calculation he made. He wasn't wrong that she was dangerous to him, Sorensen said in closing. He was wrong about why. He thought she was dangerous because she'd overheard something. She was dangerous because she remembered it exactly, understood it completely, and wasn't going to let it go. The jury deliberated for 11 hours across 2 days. Megan went home, her apartment, the small one 12 minutes from Rivergate, and she ran in the morning because her body needed it, shorter than usual, her left side still limiting the stride, and she sat at her kitchen table with coffee and waited. Priya came on the second day and they sat together without talking much, and that was the right kind of company. The verdict came in on a Thursday afternoon. Guilty. All 8 counts. Attempted murder, 2 counts of fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy, falsification of medical records, witness tampering, and the charge Sorensen had added in the 4th week of trial based on Tor's testimony, criminal diversion of patient care funds. The gallery made a sound when the last count was read. Not applause. The room didn't allow for that. More a collective exhale, the sound of pressure releasing. Megan sat with her hands flat on the prosecution table and heard each verdict and did not perform anything. She felt what she felt, which was complicated and not entirely satisfying in the way that actual outcomes were never as clean as the version you'd carried in your head during the long months of getting there. She felt tired. She felt something that was adjacent to relief but had more weight to it. She felt, underneath both of those things, a small and specific anger that had nothing to do with the verdict and everything to do with $18 million and eroded margins and patients who would never know why the care they received had been slightly less than it should have been. That anger wasn't going to resolve in a courtroom. It was the kind of anger that you carried forward and used for something, or it became the kind that corroded you from the inside. She'd figure out which one. Victor Hale sat through the verdicts with a stillness that finally broke on the 6th count. Not dramatically, no outburst, no collapse. Just a small, visible flinch, the body's involuntary response to something the mind had stopped being able to manage. She saw it. She thought he didn't know she saw it. Sentencing was 6 weeks later. Judge Pryor sentenced Victor Hale to 23 years on the state charges to be served consecutively with the federal sentence that came down 2 weeks after. An additional 19 years for the financial crimes, the conspiracy, and the obstruction. He would be 61 years old when he entered the federal facility. He would be eligible for his first review when he was 79. The Midland Healthcare Foundation was dissolved by court order. Its remaining assets, once the forensic accounting was complete, were transferred to a restitution fund. The $18 million was not fully recoverable. Some had moved too far through the shell structure to trace completely, but $11,400,000 came back. It was returned, per court order, to the Patient Care Fund at Rivergate and to 4 other regional facilities that Tor's testimony had identified as secondary recipients of the Foundation's legitimate disbursements that had been reduced to cover the diversions. Salter received 4 years and substantial fines and lost his position on the Governor's Advisory Council before sentencing was even scheduled, the Governor's office having moved swiftly and publicly to create distance. Whether that distance was principled or political was a question people argued about, and Megan found she didn't have the energy to argue about it. 4 years for Salter felt insufficient. She said so to Ferris, and Ferris agreed, and neither of them could change it. Fenner, who had perjured himself on the stand, was charged separately. He was awaiting trial. Tor served 14 months under his cooperation agreement and was released to supervised probation. That also felt insufficient. Megan said so to no one because she'd said it to Ferris, and Ferris had agreed and there was nothing else to be done about it. And spending energy on outcomes you couldn't alter was a way of diminishing the energy you had for things you could. Brooks resigned from his position as chief of surgery in the month after the verdict. He didn't leave medicine. He took a staff surgeon position at a smaller facility in western Colorado, a community hospital that operated on a fraction of Rivergate's budget and needed good surgeons the way all small facilities needed them. He sent Megan a letter, not an email. A letter, handwritten, which felt deliberate. He said he'd been sitting with his choices for a long time, and the sitting hadn't produced anything useful, so he decided to try doing something useful instead and see if that worked better. She wrote back. It took her 3 drafts to get it right, and the right version was shorter than the others, and what it said essentially was, yes, that works better. That's the correct conclusion. She returned to Rivergate in September. Not immediately. There had been months of recovery, physical and otherwise, and a period of several weeks in the early summer when she hadn't been entirely sure what shape the next version of her life was going to take. She'd sat with that uncertainty and hadn't rushed it, because rushing it would have meant choosing something before she knew what she actually wanted, which was the kind of mistake you made when you were afraid, and she was trying to be honest about what was fear and what was judgment. What she wanted, it turned out, was this: the floor, the work, the 12-hour shifts, and the patients who pulled their central lines, and the IV alarms that needed silencing, and the family consultations that ran 40 minutes over because families were people in crisis, and people in crisis needed time. The CNO who offered her the position back was not Patricia Calloway. Calloway had retired in April, quietly, citing personal reasons that everyone understood and nobody stated directly. The new CNO was a woman named Dr. Jada Finn, who had come from outside Ashford specifically because the board had decided, in the aftermath of everything, that outside was where they needed to look. Finn was direct, and she was thorough, and she sat across from Megan in the interview and said, "I'm going to ask you something that might be uncomfortable." "Go ahead." "You could do a lot of things now that aren't this, more visible things, advocacy, consulting, any number of directions." Finn paused. "Why do you want to come back to the floor?" Megan thought about it. She thought about Gerald Pitts and his central line. She thought about the woman from the highway rollover and the surgical handoff, and the family that had needed 40 minutes to absorb a diagnosis. She thought about the teenager she'd seen in the lobby going home, the one whose mother had her hand on his back. "Because the floor is where the actual work happens," she said. "Everything else is about the work. The work is the work." Finn looked at her for a moment. "Okay," she said. "When can you start?" Her first shift back was a Wednesday in early September. She arrived at 6:45, the same time she'd always arrived, and she changed in the same locker room and walked the same corridor to the same nurse's station, and Debbie Paulson was there, behind the same desk, and looked up with the expression she always used for information she considered self-evident. "Room 412 pulled his drain," Debbie said. "I'll handle it," Megan said. Debbie made the sound that was not quite agreement. Megan moved through the day the way she'd always moved, fast, head down, aware of everything without looking like she was. She caught a medication interaction on a post-surgical patient that the overnight note had missed. She spent 20 minutes with a woman who was being discharged and was scared about managing her own recovery at home, and the 20 minutes weren't in her schedule, and she gave them anyway because that was what the moment required. She got behind on charting at hour 8 and stayed 20 minutes after shift to finish it because leaving it undone was not something she was willing to do. She walked out through the main corridor at 7:22 p.m., and she passed the lobby with its framed Capital Campaign donor wall. Victor's photo had been removed, the frame replaced with a text panel about the Patient Care Fund restoration, and she pushed through the front doors and stood for a moment in the September air, which was cooling fast the way Colorado air cooled at the end of summer, dropping toward what the season was actually going to be. She thought about what Victor had believed when he'd looked at her in that corridor, that she was a problem with a shape he recognized, the shape of someone who knew something they shouldn't, the shape of a threat that could be managed with the right pressure applied in the right place. He'd assessed her in approximately 30 seconds and built an entire response around the assessment, and the assessment had been so wrong, so specifically and completely wrong, that tracing where it had failed felt almost beside the point. He hadn't asked who she was. He'd seen what she appeared to be and stopped there. That was the thing, she thought. That was the thing that organizations did, that systems did, that people with power did when they'd had it long enough to stop paying attention. They categorized instead of looked. They took the shape of a thing and responded to the shape without checking what was inside it. A nurse in scrubs in a hospital corridor. Management of the problem accordingly. What he hadn't been able to manage was that the nurse in scrubs had spent 6 years learning, in the most unforgiving possible environment, how to hold on in bad conditions, how to keep moving when stopping felt like the more survivable option, how to remember exactly what you'd seen and heard and done, because in the field, imprecision cost lives. And so precision became a reflex, and reflexes didn't stop when you changed careers. She had been invisible by design. Her service record classified, her training unremarked, her capability folded into the unremarkable routine of daily hospital work. That invisibility had felt, at times, like a loss, like something she'd given up in exchange for a quieter life. It turned out it had been the whole thing. It had been exactly what the situation required. She stood in the September air for another moment. Her left side ached with the specific persistence that Dr. Felda had accurately predicted, the kind that arrived at the end of a long shift and sat there reminding you that the body kept its own record of events. She didn't mind it. It was honest. It was the body telling the truth about what had happened, and she had come to believe over the course of everything that things that told the truth were worth keeping. She walked to her car. She drove home through the early dark of a Colorado September, the mountains invisible in the distance, but present the way they were always present, felt rather than seen, weight on the horizon. She thought about the patient care fund and the $11 million returned to it and what that money would become over the next years. Equipment, training, staffing buffers, the 1,000 small things that kept a medical facility functional and safe. Things that patients would benefit from and never know why they had them. The same invisibility, running in the opposite direction. That seemed right to her. That seemed like the correct shape for it to take. She thought about what it meant to do something that mattered without anyone watching, and whether the watching was what made it matter. And she had come to a clear enough answer on that to stop turning it over. It didn't. The watching didn't make it matter. The work made it matter. The work had always made it matter in classified forward environments and 12-hour trauma shifts alike. And the recognition, when it came, was real, and she didn't diminish it. The verdicts, the restitution, Vaughn's testimony, all of it. But it had not been why she'd walked back into the hospital that morning 2 years ago and started moving through the work. She hadn't done it to be seen. She'd done it because patients needed nurses, and she was a nurse, and that was the sum of it. Victor Hale had tried to bury that under the weight of his own machinery. The altered timestamps, the jurisdictional motions, the paid witness, the full architecture of a man who had spent 20 years learning to make things disappear. He'd had resources and lawyers and time and relationships that reached into the structures of power in ways she was still, occasionally, discovering the scope of. What he hadn't had was a single honest thing. Not one. Every move he'd made from the corridor outward had been built on the premise that reality was manageable if you controlled the documentation of it. That what happened was less important than what the record said happened. That a nurse who heard something could be made, through sufficient administrative pressure, into a nurse who had not heard anything, or who had heard something wrong, or who couldn't be trusted to report it accurately. He'd put 5 bullets in the direction of that theory. She was still here. She pulled into her parking spot and sat in the car for a moment with the engine off and the silence around her, and she thought about tomorrow. Another shift, another patient load, another set of problems that needed managing. She thought about Priya, who was working nights again and who had, without discussion, simply shown up during every hard week with the unassuming steadiness of a person who understood that presence was the primary form of support. She thought about Gerald Pitts, who had been discharged long ago, and whose follow-up records showed he'd recovered well, and who had sent a card to the unit that the staff had pinned to the break room board. She thought about the teenager in the lobby. She got out of the car. The night was clear and cold, and the stars were coming out in the way they came out in Colorado when the air was right, more of them than you expected, more than any of it felt like it should hold. She went inside. She made dinner. She was tired in the honest way of a full day's work, and she didn't fight it. Some things that needed to be true eventually became true. Not fast, not without cost, not without the specific damage that came from being the person who stood in the path of something large and refused to move. But eventually. If you were precise and you were patient and you kept the documentation and you didn't let the weight of the machinery convince you that the machinery was correct, eventually the weight shifted. And the woman who had been standing underneath it was still standing.